Hi, everyone. Welcome to another HOSS Talks FOSS. I'm here with Pep Pla, one of our professional service engineers here at Percona. Hi, Pep. How you doing today?
Hi, fine, really great. I'm in Barcelona, and today is a sunny day, so the weather is fine. It's Friday, so we have to talk about backups. What else?
Yes, yeah, it's a nice Friday day here as well. I don't know when we'll actually be broadcasting this particular session, so it might be Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, wherever you are, but we hope your day is going well as well. So, um, Pep, you put together a workshop for Percona Live that was on extra backup and backing up your MySQL databases. And it was really, really well attended. And I thought that it would be good for us to sit down and talk a little bit about backups, give people some guidance. Some people will find some time later on to go through that workshop. It's 2 hours. It is free. It's on YouTube. You can go watch it right now. So that's exciting. But wanted to talk a little bit about backups and maybe give people the really high level view of some of the things that are important in the backup space. So, Pep, you've been in the database space for years and years and years. I mean, I remember talking to you, God, it must have been 10 years ago.
Sort of.
And yes, yes. And so I know you've been in this space for quite some time. Now, when we talk about MySQL backups, what do you see is the most common mistake that people make when they set up their backups?
I think the most common mistake is focusing on backups. Actually,
Okay,
backups don't matter.
okay,
And it's quite shocking seeing this in a conference about backups. Backups only matter for compliance. That's the only reason you are forced to have some kind of backup. What really matters is recovery.
ah,
You don't need a backup strategy. You don't need to think about backups. You need to think about recovery because the important subject is recovery. If you have a great backup, but for whatever reason you are not able to recover it in time, for example, then your backup it doesn't matter. I used to say that you can have 19. I prefer to have 99 failed backups and one successful recovery than 99 successful backups and one failed recovery, because the real critical issue is recovery. And uh, this is the whole point of the beginning of my talk was you need to think about the things that can happen. Uh, Obviously, the amount of things that can happen is infinite, and you can't probably prepare for everything. And then you have to decide what kind of protections you are going to apply, and then prepare the backups to cover these possible incidents.
so okay, so first of all, your piece of advice is very sound. It is, backups don't matter, recovery does. So you have to do what is required to recover. And so obviously,
You
that's a
need
big
backups.
thing. But people do make mistakes when thinking about recovery or backups. And one of those mistakes is commonly never testing recovery.
Yes, yes. This brings me an interesting concept. It's the Schrödinger backup. It's this is a backup that you did successfully, but you are not able to recover. So it's a backup that is at the same time is in two states. So, for example, if you have a really large database, you can have some fast disks. You can have all the infrastructure to be able to make the backup. But if you don't have a good support contract, in the case of you are working with bare metal, you can find that your server is not available, and you will need 1 week to get the server. So the whole point is that you need to think on the problems and then fix them. And obviously, you need to test your backups.
Well, but with a terabyte-sized backup, how do you test that?
With money.
With money? And how often do you test it?
Well, it depends on how important is your database and how resilient is your company to be, for example, 1 month without that database. So if I used to work for a company that they said we made some numbers, and we, in case of an incident, if we are not able to bring the system back in 3 days, it doesn't matter because the company has to close. So you need to test. It doesn't matter the size of the database. For a company like this, you need to test the backup, and you need to make sure that you are able to recover the database in less than 3 days. And this is a cost that you need to assume. It's pretty much the same that if you buy an insurance. We are used to pay for insurance, for security, physical security, guards, and things like that. We also have to pay for backups, and we need to know what we want to be protected of. So in the case of a really huge database, or whatever, if you really want to recover it, you need to test backups. So there's another approach. Okay. Is make the database smaller.
Okay.
Sometimes you have 3 terabytes of things that are important but not that important, and this is also part of the Schrödinger backup. That's something which is really very depressing, is to be recovering something and seeing that you are recovering data that is not important, and you are 2 days waiting for old log files being recovered until the backup is recovered completely. Then you can start and you say, okay, the data I really needed was just a part of the database or just a part of the files.
Well, isn't this where logical backups versus physical can sometimes come in, as well as, like you can do things with just backing up certain tables?
It's not only logical versus physical. I'm quite old, and I remember doing backups using tapes.
Oh, yes.
And when you write a tape, the order of the files really matters. Because, for example, if you write the catalog of the backup at the end of the tape, you need to load the tape, move forward till the catalog, then rewind and start recovering. You need to read the tape twice. So it's you need to test recovery to know the issues you will find, and sometimes you need to use the right tool. So, for example, in the case of if you want to recover just one table, you can use extra backup. You don't need to use MySQL dump.
Okay, great. And as you start to look at people who set up their backup strategy and they start to implement that, are there any best practices around things like how often you should be backing up, or how often you should retain or keep your backups, on near storage versus maybe putting them on an S3 bucket or something else? Because as you start to move your backups around, it's going to always be faster to have them something that's live, ready to access, And then as soon as you start to move them to something that's a little slower, like an S3, or like you said, a backup tape, if you're really old school, it takes a lot longer to get those. So are there some best practices or some rules of thumb that you would recommend people follow in terms of backup retention and where they retain those and how often they're keeping those backups?
My recommendation is first, do not use a single backup strategy. What I mean is, usually backup is pretty much like, well, I have a backup, that's it. I really recommend, for example, use a mixed strategy of physical and logical backups. So sometimes, for example, once a week you do a physical backup, then every day you perform incrementals, and then maybe once a month you perform a logical backup. Just to have both versions of the thing. Okay, for various reasons. For example, if you have some kind of corruption, sometimes you can, by copying the files, you are transmitting the corruption, you are replicating the corruption. If you force reading the whole database, you will find that corruption. The database server will detect it and say, okay, I have here in this block of disk something is broken. And if possible, backup your bin logs also. Point-in-time recovery is the kind of thing that really makes you happy when you do it. And when you recover something and you can say to your boss, don't worry, we have no data loss, or maybe 3 seconds data loss, because we were able to recover from a physical or logical backup, and then we were able to apply the binary logs. Here is your business back. Don't worry, I'm sorry, it took 3 hours. When you do these kind of things, your boss looks at you and says, oh, he knows what he's doing. And this kind of things are really very important. So for me, it's keep a mixed strategy of backups and backup your binary logs. And regarding how long you have to keep your backups, it depends on compliance. It depends on the size of the database, obviously, because the bigger, more space you need to store the database. And it depends also on what you want to be protected of. But what I've seen usually is that having an 1 month old database provides really few value.
Except for compliance reasons.
Yes. If there's an incident, usually you if you are on e-commerce, you are not going to restore 1 month old database.
Yeah, and we see a lot of people will keep those longer term on something that is slower and much longer access time, right? So you might keep 7 years worth of backups somewhere outside of where you would normally restore from. Because I think a lot of people, they look at ways to cut corners on backups. And so let me kind of give you a scenario on what I've seen in my past. You mentioned the mixed backups. So a lot of times as data gets bigger, it's not easy to do a full backup every night, or even multiple times a day in some cases. So what you'll see is, the first, like once a week full backup and then incrementals daily. If the databases are smaller, then, a database backup a day tends to be generally the rule of thumb. And then you mentioned keeping the binary logs, or the transaction logs, having those for the full day allows you to do that point in time recovery. What I've seen is kind of a standard thing in a lot of organizations is they'll leave 7 days on disk, So they'll have, the last 7 days, so they can pick any day, do a full restore, point in time to the point where, things got wonky or that they need it, and then, pull back. And then after that, they'll take those backups and then move them to S3, move them to, like the longer term storage somewhere else that's, slower disk. Also seen where they might only take one of those backups every week and then store just the one from every week, in the slower space. And so, and then that could be a 7-year retention cycle. I mean, even 15 years ago, when I was doing Oracle DBA work, we had a requirement to keep everything for 7 years for compliance reasons. And it's only gotten way more, compliant and way more sensitive around what you keep and what might have to be, pulled out. But that leads to a whole litany of other issues, because restoring a database from 5 years ago or 7 years ago doesn't necessarily mean the application will even work.
Actually, you can have issues to find the software. So you can have the data, but you don't have the distribution, or you are not able to install
the version of MySQL or the version of, like whatever database that might not exist anymore. It might have been, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of, fun things that could happen. And I think that's where it's a real challenge when you start to think about the compliance side, which is why most, DBAs, most sysadmins, most people who are in charge of backups are thinking short term. And, when you think that, like week or maybe a couple months out, the odds of you having to do a recovery scenario really short term,
yes.
It could happen, but as you go on, like you mentioned, the data value tends to diminish over time, right? Because what are the odds that you're going to go back? I need to go a month ago and restore a month ago's backup. You're not going to do it, because typically what the recovery scenarios that I've seen, and you could tell me what you've seen, would be something like, okay, so if you have a full system crash, it happens. Not very often, but it happens. It's typically going to be, I deployed some code.
Yes. Absolutely.
I deleted data that I shouldn't have. I need to roll back, whatever. And it might be one table. It might be two tables.
Or even situations like, I deployed some code that produces corruption at logical level under some limited circumstances. And then I know that probably 3% of the data on those three tables is not good. So it's you probably need to recover 1 month backup and then compare and start to undo the thing that the development broke. This is why for long-term backups, I recommend logical backups. Just for one reason. They are readable. You can, obviously it can be a really huge file, but you can split it, you can use a program, whatever, and you can import the data, but also you can analyze the data from the backup. If it's a logical backup. If it's a physical backup, you could try to write some tools or recover something, but it would be really more complex. But in the case of compliance and long-term backups, I really recommend logical backups.
Okay. And so, most of your talk is centered around not only, backups in general, but really specifically extra backup. And you do a deep dive into some of the extra backup things. So what are some of the features that you found really useful coming from, a space where, in the past, extra backup didn't exist and now it's there? What are some of those things that you think are really kind of interesting and people maybe don't know about and should?
In my talk, I described extra backup as the Swiss Army knife of MySQL backups. because you can do almost everything. So for me, the most useful feature is the streaming backup, because I use it a lot for rebuilding slaves, creating new slaves. It's like you just start the backup, send it across the network. You don't need to write it somewhere and then transfer the file. If you do a MySQL dump, you need to write it somewhere and then load. You can just stream the backup, uncompress at the same time on the destination, prepare, and that's it. And you have a replica in the time you need to make the backup.
So, and just to let everybody know who might not understand what streaming backups are or the process, typically when you would back up in the past, and we're going to talk a little bit about history, you would take a copy of the files and you would copy them onto disk, and then from that disk you would copy them to another server and then restore them on the other server. So you have the copy, and then you have the network copy time, and then you have the restore time. In this case, what the streaming does is allow you to set the other destination and stream the backup directly, in a compressed way. So it speeds up your time. It could save you hours on larger backups, or even days.
And actually, under some circumstances, it can make the backup, the cloning possible, because sometimes you don't have enough space to keep one copy of the database locally, then transfer to another server. Very often you have a server that has roughly 80% of the disk used. So if you need to write the backup, you need to find the space to write it. So streaming, you save a lot of space. You can compress. You can avoid compression depending on the CPU and your network. So it's really very flexible. For me, that's the most useful feature. But you can do almost everything. You can recover one table and create. So it's a perfect tool.
Yeah, and you mentioned, it's interesting. You mentioned space, right? And this is an interesting, I'll jump into that real quick before we go back to extra backup. Space is cheap, most people say, but it does add up. And, when you start to think about, backups and how you implement your backup setup, the impact on your costs, especially when you're looking at a cloud, based setup, could be substantially high, right? So if you go back to, the scenario that I mentioned, right, which is, okay, we're going to, have 7 days worth of backups and binary logs. That's potentially 7 times the disk space. Now, of course, you can compress, but you'll need a staging environment as well to, copy the files over, then compress them, then move them, and then do you want to keep, one copy uncompressed and then the rest compressed? You're talking about having, if you've got a terabyte, system, you might need 7 or 8 terabytes of actual space. And those 7 or 8 terabytes might never be used other than just for backups.
Yes, and the problem is that we are seeing, we have really large customers with tons of servers. If you have to allocate extra space for certain operations on each server, and you have, let's say, 5,000 servers, that's a lot of space. That's not that cheap.
Well, and this is where a lot of people have gone to streaming or sending things directly to S3 or, other storage mechanisms, which saves on the cost, but it increases your mean time to recover in a lot of cases, because that is designed as slower access storage. So to get a terabyte backup off of one of these services, it can take a while. And that's where you have to, maybe you send 7 days there and 1 day is always online, but that still doubles your space. And again, if you've got thousands of databases, it really does add up.
Yes. I see offline backups or remote backups and cold storage backups more like compliance or not urgent recovery backup. It's more like I need to have data for 7 years, so I'm going to store it at the cheapest possible location because my real concern is compliance. This is why at the beginning I said usually people never should worry about backups unless compliance, because it's the only specific that says, okay, you need to have a backup with this and that and this data. And
so here's the one danger, though, and let me throw this out there because this is a danger that I do see. Is, I think a lot of people do buy into that they're thinking recovery and then compliance for backups, but people use their recovery strategy as replication or a cluster.
That's not recovery. That's high availability, and this is a part of the equation, but it's not. I've seen a lot of people that says, well, I have 12 replicas in 3 different DCs, so I don't need backups. Well, you don't need backups unless somebody drops a table accidentally, just because they connected to production thinking
it happens. That does happen.
And it happens. It happens
a lot.
Usually, yes. Usually, the largest and costly incidents are related to people.
Right. Because, what people have to remember is when you talk about a cluster, you talk about a replica, what comes in gets streamed and replicated to the others. So, you've got the delete statement, you've got an alter table statement, you've got a migration that you do in code. It propagates to all the systems. Now, some people will go, oh, well, I'm going to delay, have a replica that's delayed an hour to protect myself. Well, that's wonderful, except what's the odds you're going to catch the problem in the first hour? A lot of times these go for a day or longer before somebody makes the decision to pull the plug. You might find out right away that there's something wrong, but you don't go fail over or restore from backup within the first 5 minutes of an issue, right? Typically there's like, oh, well, what is the, I don't know. Like, people don't make that call quickly. And I think that that's one of the issues you see.
And incidents usually don't appear when after you have drink your coffee and you are fresh and you are prepared at your job. Probably the incident, you are driving, it's Friday night, your kids, and all of a sudden you get the call and says, there's something wrong happening. And then you need to start thinking, and probably you will not stop the replica.
Right. Yep. So, okay, Pep. So maybe give us a quick overview of, like, the session. What, if people want to go find it, like I said, it's on YouTube. What are they going to learn if they watch it? Tell us, like, maybe give us a quick, what's going to be in there, and why should they watch that?
I think the main purpose of the talk was something I've seen is people is a bit scared or does not understand how extra backup works, and people does some things like cold backups and things like that, because making a backup from a physical backup from a running database at the beginning sounds like this can't be consistent. So during the talk, I explained that actually what extra backup does is makes a backup and copies the data to make it consistent. And this is why it's completely reliable, and you can trust your backup. And also I explain the prepare phase and things like that, because the tool is really very powerful. You can do a lot of things. This is the second part of the talk. I explain how you can do almost everything you can do with extra backup. And the idea is really you should stop worrying and love your backups.
Okay.
And
or love your recovery in this case.
I love your recovery, exactly. And extra backup is really. I'm a Percona guy, but I'm not an extra backup developer at all, and so I could have some distance from the tool, and it's really a great tool. Okay. So I'm really surprised to find some of our clients that they don't use it as a weapon of choice for things like cloning databases and things like that.
Okay, so everyone, if you haven't checked it out, check out Pep's talk. It should be up on YouTube from Percona Live. It's a 2-hour tutorial, kind of walking through how to set up and use extra backup for various scenarios. As Pep mentioned, he'll talk through cloning and doing regular backups and some of the features like streaming, how to set it up, and how to really make sure that you have a recovery strategy that's going to work in larger and smaller, every environment in between. And so I would really encourage you to check that out when you do have a chance, and download extra backup to see what that's all about. But Pep, thanks for taking a few moments today, chatting with me about backups, jamming out, what we got to worry about, why we should worry and why we shouldn't worry. I do appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.